The man by the river. The river had long since forgotten how to roar. It moved now in a slow, shallow whisper, tracing a thin silver line through the dry land as if reluctant to stay. Along its edge, the earth cracked under the weight of a season that had given more dust than rain. It was a place where silence lingered too long, and where people learned to live with what was missing. Noah stood at the bank, skipping stones with a precision that came from practice, not play. Each throw was careful, deliberate, far too measured for a boy of 8. Beside him, Lily crouched near the water, trailing her fingers through the current, watching the ripples as if they might answer questions she did not yet know how to ask. They had wandered farther than usual, though neither of them had mentioned it. There was no one at home to stop them. Back at the house, Eliza Hart stood by the window, her fingers resting lightly against the wooden frame as she watched the horizon. The sky stretched endlessly, pale and empty, much like the silence that had settled into her life. She could not remember the last time the house had felt full of laughter, of warmth, of anything that lingered beyond obligation. Thomas had left before dawn. He often did. At first, she had asked where he went, why he returned so late, why his eyes no longer met hers when she spoke. His answers had come sharp and brief, as though her questions were inconveniences rather than concerns. Over time, she had stopped asking, not because she no longer cared, but because she had learned the weight of unanswered questions. A faint unease stirred in her chest as she glanced again toward the distant river. The children had been gone longer than usual. Noah's latest stone skipped twice before sinking. He frowned slightly, as if disappointed in something more than the throw itself. Lily, still crouched, suddenly stilled her hand. "Noah," she whispered. There was something in her voice, small but urgent, that made him turn immediately. At first, he saw nothing but the same stretch of dry grass and uneven ground. Then, beneath the shade of a large, weathered tree, something shifted. A man. He lay slumped against the trunk, one leg stretched awkwardly before him. His clothes were worn, his chest bare, and his skin carried the deep tone of someone shaped by sun and hardship. But it was the dark stain along his thigh that drew the eye, a wound, fresh enough to glisten despite the dust. Noah instinctively stepped in front of Lily. "Stay back," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The man did not move. For a long moment, the only sound was the river's quiet murmur. Then, slowly, the man's head tilted and his eyes opened. They were sharp despite the exhaustion behind them, alert in a way that made Noah hesitate. There was no immediate threat in them, only pain and something harder to define. Lily moved before Noah could stop her. "He's hurt," she said simply. Noah reached for her arm, but she had already taken a few careful steps forward. The man watched her, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in restraint, as if even the smallest movement cost him. "Don't come closer," he said, his voice low and strained. It wasn't a warning. It was concern. Lily paused, looking back at Noah, uncertain. Noah hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, to pull his sister away and run back to the safety of what little they had. But something else held him there, a quiet recognition that this man, dangerous or not, was alone and losing. "We can help," Noah said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. The man studied him for a moment, as if weighing the truth of that statement against the reality of his situation. Then, with visible effort, he shifted slightly, his breath catching as pain surged through him. "No," he said again, more firmly this time. "You should go." But Lily had already closed the distance. She knelt beside him, her small hands hovering uncertainly near the wound, not touching, just present. "You're bleeding," she said softly, as though he might not have noticed. For the first time, something in the man's expression changed. Not relief, not quite trust, but a flicker of something close to it. Noah exhaled slowly. They were no longer leaving. By the time they reached home, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the dry ground. Between them, the man leaned heavily, each step a struggle he refused to acknowledge aloud. Eliza saw them before they reached the door. For a moment, she didn't move. Her children, her quiet, careful children, were guiding a stranger toward the house. A wounded stranger. Fear rose first, sharp and immediate. Then something else followed, quieter but no less powerful. Recognition. Not of the man, but of the moment itself, the kind that changed things before you had time to understand how. "Noah," she called, stepping forward, her voice steady despite the sudden tension in her chest. "What is this?" Noah met her gaze, his expression unusually firm. "He needs help." Eliza's eyes shifted to the man. He stood there, barely upright, yet there was a dignity in the way he held himself, even in weakness. His gaze met hers briefly, then dropped, not in submission, but in respect. For a fleeting second, she thought of Thomas, of how easily he looked away. The comparison unsettled her. "We can't just bring strangers into the house," she said, though the words felt weaker than they should have. Lily stepped closer, her small hand brushing against Eliza's. "He told us to leave," she said, "but he didn't ask for help. We chose to." Eliza looked down at her daughter, then back at the man. He hadn't begged. He hadn't demanded. He had simply endured. Something shifted. "Inside," she said quietly. Noah didn't hesitate. As they moved past her, Eliza remained at the doorway for a moment longer, watching the fading light stretch across the empty land. A strange certainty settled over her, unwelcome, yet impossible to ignore. This was not just an act of kindness. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. And once begun, it would not be easily undone. What remains unsaid? The house felt different that night. Not louder, not warmer, just altered in a way that settled uneasily into the walls. The presence of a stranger had shifted something subtle but undeniable, like a breath held too long finally released. Eliza noticed it in the way Noah stayed close to the doorway, alert without appearing so, and in how Lily moved quietly, her usual restlessness softened into careful attention. The man lay on a narrow cot near the far wall, his injury cleaned as best as Eliza could manage. The blood had slowed, though not entirely stopped, and the cloth wrapped around his thigh had already begun to darken again. He had not complained once. That unsettled her more than if he had. "Drink," she said, holding out a cup of water. He accepted it with a slight nod, his movements controlled, as if he refused to let pain dictate anything more than necessity. Up close, his exhaustion was clearer, etched into the lines of his face and the heaviness behind his eyes. Yet there was something steady beneath it, something that did not bend easily. "Cale," he said after a moment, his voice low but clearer now. "My name." Eliza hesitated before responding. Eliza. She did not offer more, and he did not ask. The quiet that followed was not awkward, but deliberate. It was the kind of silence that revealed rather than concealed, where words were unnecessary because too much already lingered beneath them. Across the room, Noah watched carefully. "Will he stay?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried more weight than it should have. Eliza glanced at Cale, then back at her son. "Only until he can leave," she replied. Noah nodded, though something in his expression suggested he had expected a different answer. Lily said nothing, but she settled herself on the floor nearby, close enough to see Cale without being in the way. Her presence was quiet, almost instinctive, as if she understood something the others had yet to name. Thomas returned well after nightfall. The door opened with more force than necessary, breaking the fragile stillness that had settled over the house. His boots struck the floor with a dull, uneven rhythm, and a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume followed him inside, subtle, but not enough to go unnoticed. Eliza felt it before she acknowledged it. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice even. Thomas removed his coat slowly, avoiding her gaze. "Out." It was the same answer he always gave. Brief, dismissive, final. His eyes moved across the room, pausing when they landed on Cale. For a moment, his expression hardened, not with concern, but with irritation. "What is this?" he asked. Noah straightened slightly, as though preparing for something. "He's hurt," Lily said quietly. Thomas's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Eliza. And you thought bringing him here was a good idea? There was no curiosity in his tone, only accusation. Eliza held his gaze. He needed help. That's not our problem. The words came quickly, without hesitation, as though the decision required no thought at all. A flicker of something passed through Cale's expression. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition. He had seen this kind of response before. Eliza felt it too. It wasn't just the words. It was the certainty behind them. The ease with which Thomas dismissed the situation, the complete absence of hesitation where compassion should have lived. For a moment, she saw her life with him as it truly was, not in fragments or excuses, but in its entirety. And it felt smaller than she had allowed herself to admit. "He's staying," she said. The statement hung in the air, quiet but immovable. Thomas let out a short, humorless breath. "You don't get to decide that alone." Eliza didn't look away. "I already did." The tension sharpened, stretching thin between them. For a brief second, it seemed as though something might break, something long overdue. But Thomas only shook his head, his expression shifting from irritation to something colder. "Do what you want," he muttered. "You always do." It wasn't true. That was what struck her most. For years, she had done the opposite, bending, adjusting, quieting herself to avoid conflict, to maintain something that no longer resembled a partnership. And yet, in this moment, when she chose differently, he spoke as though she had always been the difficult one. The realization settled heavily in her chest. He turned away before she could respond, moving toward the far room without another glance at her, or the children. The door closed behind him with a dull finality. The silence that followed felt different from before. Not fragile, not uncertain. Clear. Noah exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to betray the tension he had been holding. Lily shifted closer to the cot, her small hand resting lightly against the edge, as though anchoring herself to something steady. Cale watched them both, his gaze thoughtful. "He does not see you," he said quietly. The words were not meant as judgment. They were simple, direct, an observation offered without expectation. Eliza felt them more deeply than she expected. For a moment, she considered denying it, defending Thomas out of habit, out of the reflex she had built over years of quiet endurance. But the words would not come, because they would not be true. "No," she said finally. It was the first honest answer she had given in a long time. Cale nodded once, as though that was enough. Across the room, Noah met his mother's gaze. There was no confusion in his expression, no uncertainty, only a quiet understanding that felt far older than his years. Eliza realized, with a sudden and uncomfortable clarity, that her children had seen far more than she had ever acknowledged, and they had learned from it. The thought lingered as she turned back toward the dim light of the room, where shadows stretched long and uneven across the floor. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been repaired. But something had shifted subtly, irrevocably. And for the first time, Eliza did not feel the urge to ignore it. The breaking point. The air inside the house had changed. It no longer carried the quiet weight of avoidance, but something sharper, something that refused to be ignored. Every movement, every glance felt deliberate now, as though the truth that had surfaced could not be pushed back beneath the surface again. Eliza noticed it first in the children. Noah no longer hovered in uncertainty. His awareness had shifted into something steadier, more resolved. He moved with quiet purpose, his attention no longer divided between what was said and what was hidden. Lily, too, had changed in smaller ways. She stayed close, her usual softness now edged with a subtle caution, as if she sensed the fragility of everything around her. And then there was Cale. He had regained enough strength to stand without support, though he still favored one leg. His presence remained quiet, but it was no longer passive. He observed, measured, understood, and in doing so, made everything else feel more exposed. Eliza felt it most, not because he spoke often, but because he didn't. There was no pretense in him, no carefully constructed distance, and that made it impossible to retreat into the habits she had lived with for so long. Thomas returned earlier than usual that evening. The shift in timing alone was enough to signal something had changed. He entered without hesitation, his gaze sweeping across the room with a sharper edge than before, as though he had already decided what he would find. His eyes landed on Cale. Standing. Present. Still there. I thought you'd be gone by now, Thomas said. Cale met his gaze without tension. I leave when I can walk without burdening others, he replied. Thomas's expression tightened. You're already a burden. The words hung in the air, blunt and deliberate. Noah stepped forward before he could stop himself. He's not, he said. The room stilled. Thomas looked at him, something unreadable passing through his expression. Not anger, not quite surprise, but something colder. You don't get to decide that, he replied. Noah didn't move. Neither do you. The quiet defiance in his voice carried more weight than shouting ever could. Eliza felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with recognition. This was no longer a house where silence could protect them. This was a house where everything had already been seen. Enough, Eliza said, stepping between them. Her voice was calm, but it carried a finality that demanded attention. This doesn't need to turn into something worse. Thomas let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly. It already has, he said. You brought a stranger into this house and decided that was acceptable. I brought someone who needed help, she replied. You brought someone who doesn't belong here. The emphasis was clear. Eliza held his gaze. Neither does dishonesty, she said. The shift was immediate. Thomas's posture stiffened, his expression hardening as the conversation moved away from what he could control. We're not doing this again, he said. No, Eliza replied. We're finishing it. The words settled into the room with quiet force. For a moment, Thomas said nothing. Then he laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think this changes anything? He asked. You think standing here, saying all this, suddenly gives you control? Eliza didn't react to the provocation. This isn't about control, she said. It's about truth. Thomas's gaze flicked briefly toward Cale, then back to her. And he's the one helping you find that? He asked. There it was. Not accusation of wrongdoing, but implication. Eliza understood it immediately and rejected it just as quickly. This has nothing to do with him, she said. It has everything to do with what you've already done. Thomas's jaw tightened. You're deflecting. I'm being clear. The distinction mattered. And for the first time, Thomas seemed to feel it. Cale shifted slightly, his presence drawing attention without effort. This conflict began before I arrived, he said quietly. His tone was steady, not defensive, not confrontational, simply factual. Thomas turned to him, irritation sharpening. Stay out of it. Cale didn't move. I am, he replied. But truth does not change when ignored. The simplicity of his statement cut deeper than argument. For a moment, Thomas had no response, because there was nothing to counter. The tension reached its peak in the silence that followed. Eliza felt it, not as pressure, but as clarity. Everything that had been uncertain was no longer unclear. Everything that had been avoided was now unavoidable. She took a slow breath. This isn't a life, she said. Not for me. Not for them. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the children. Noah stood still, his expression steady. Lily remained close, her small hand gripping the fabric of Eliza's dress. Thomas followed her gaze, then looked back at her. So what? He asked. You're leaving? The question lingered, not as a challenge, as a test. Eliza didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, she wasn't reacting. She was choosing. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, carrying a quiet, restless energy across the land. Cale turned slightly toward the open doorway, his posture shifting as though preparing for movement. He understood the moment for what it was, not resolution, but decision. Some paths did not reveal themselves until everything else had fallen away. Inside, Eliza lifted her gaze. I don't know what comes next, she said. The honesty in her voice did not weaken her. It steadied her. But I know this doesn't. Thomas watched her, searching for hesitation, for doubt, anything he could still hold on to. There was none, only certainty, not loud, not forceful, but unshakable. The silence that followed was not empty. It was decisive. For the first time, The future was no longer something that would happen to Eliza. It was something she would determine. And that changed everything. Not because the path was clear, but because she had finally stepped onto it. The choice that remains. The days that followed did not bring peace. They brought clarity. It settled slowly into the house, not as comfort, but as something sharper, like light falling across a surface that had long remained in shadow. Nothing looked the same once it was fully seen. Thomas left again the next morning. This time, he did not offer even the illusion of explanation. The absence of pretense made his departure quieter, but heavier, as though whatever had once connected him to the house had finally thinned beyond repair. Eliza watched him go without calling after him. There had been a time when silence like this would have felt like surrender. Now it felt like acknowledgement of what was already gone and what no longer needed to be chased. Behind her, the house remained still, but not empty. Cale had begun to move more freely, though each step still carried a measured restraint. He spent most of his time outside now, seated beneath the same wide tree where the children had first found him. From there, he watched the land with quiet attention, as though listening to something deeper than sound. Noah sat nearby, carving small shapes into a piece of wood with careful precision. His movements mirrored Cale's in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, deliberate, focused, patient. "You hold it too tight," Cale said, his voice low. Noah glanced at him. "It slips if I don't." Cale shook his head slightly. "It slips because you expect it to." Noah frowned, adjusting his grip. This time his hand loosened, not entirely but enough. The blade moved smoother, cleaner. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed. Lily, seated in the grass, watched both of them with quiet fascination. She had taken to following Cale wherever he went, not out of dependency, but out of curiosity. There was something about him that made the world feel steadier, even when nothing else did. Eliza saw it. She saw it in the way Noah no longer stood as rigidly at every sound, and in the way Lily's laughter, soft and rare, had begun to return in fleeting moments. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't sudden, but it was real, and it unsettled her more than she expected, because it revealed something she could no longer deny. They had been missing this. Not Cale specifically, but what he represented. Presence. Attention. A kind of quiet strength that did not demand, did not withdraw, and did not disappear when it mattered most. She turned away from the window. The realization followed her. Thomas returned late again, but this time he did not enter unnoticed. Eliza was waiting. She stood near the doorway, her posture still, her expression composed in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. The moment he stepped inside, he paused, not out of surprise but recognition. Something had changed. "You're waiting up now?" he asked, his tone edged with faint amusement. Eliza didn't respond to it. "We need to finish this," she said. Thomas removed his coat slowly, setting it aside with deliberate calm. He had always preferred control, over conversations, over outcomes, over anything that might shift beyond his expectation. "There's nothing to finish," he replied. "You've already decided how you feel." Eliza held his gaze. "No," she said. "I've decided what I see." That caught his attention. He looked at her more closely now, as though reassessing something he had long taken for granted. "And what is that?" he asked. Eliza didn't hesitate. "I see a man who stayed where he didn't want to be," she said. "Not out of loyalty, but out of convenience." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly. "That's your interpretation. It's the truth." The certainty in her voice left no space for deflection. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, but it did not weaken her resolve. If anything, it steadied it. "You chose someone else," she continued. "Not just once, but enough times that it stopped feeling like a mistake." Thomas exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. Eliza felt them settle, not as a wound, but as confirmation. "It mattered," she said. "You just stopped caring that it did." Thomas didn't deny it, because he couldn't. Outside, the wind shifted. A faint rustle moved through the dry grass, carrying with it the kind of stillness that comes just before something changes. Cale stood near the edge of the yard, his posture firm despite the lingering stiffness in his leg. He had heard enough. Not the words themselves, but the tone beneath them. It was familiar. Conflict that had waited too long. Truth that had come too late. He turned slightly as Noah approached, his expression uncertain. "Are you leaving?" Noah asked. Cale looked at him. "Soon," he said. Noah nodded, though his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "You don't have to," he replied. Cale's gaze softened slightly. "Yes," he said, "I do. Not because he wanted to, but because some things were not meant to be stayed in, no matter how much they were needed." Inside, Eliza took a breath. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said. Thomas looked at her sharply. "What?" "I'm not asking you to explain," she continued. "And I'm not asking you to fix this." Each word was measured, intentional. "I'm telling you that I'm done pretending this is something it's not." The finality in her voice left no room for misinterpretation. For the first time, Thomas had no immediate response. Because this wasn't an argument. It was a conclusion. The night deepened around them, quiet but unyielding. Outside, Cale stood beneath the fading light, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The land stretched wide and uncertain, but it was honest in a way that walls could never be. Behind him, the house remained, changed but not yet settled. Some endings did not arrive with closure. Some only created space for something else to begin. Cale exhaled slowly, shifting his weight as he tested his footing. The pain remained, but it no longer controlled him. Inside, Eliza stood alone, the silence around her no longer something to endure, but something to shape. And in that fragile, uncertain stillness, one truth became clear. The life she had been living was over. What came next would be entirely her choice.